The morning sun cast long shadows across the University of Ouagadougou as hundreds of people streamed through the gates of the institution's largest auditorium. March 15, 2024, would become a date etched in the memory of everyone present. A day when a single moment would redefine what leadership looks like in the face of public humiliation. The auditorium itself was a testament to Burkina Faso's educational aspirations. Built in the 1980s during Thomas Sankara's revolutionary period, its concrete walls had witnessed decades of political speeches, academic debates, and student protests. Today, however, it was hosting something different, a dialogue between Africa's youngest head of state and the continent's future leaders. Ibrahim Traoré had arrived early, as was his custom. At 36, he carried himself with the bearing of someone who had seen combat, survived assassination attempts, and shouldered the weight of a nation's hopes. Yet there was something approachable about him, something that made students feel comfortable approaching him in the corridors before the event began. "Monsieur le Président," a young woman had said to him in the hallway, speaking in Moor, one of Burkina Faso's indigenous languages. "My little brother wants to join the military to serve our country." What should I tell him? Ibrahim had stopped, given her his full attention, and responded in the same language. "Tell him that serving our country means many things. It can mean being a teacher, a farmer, a doctor, or yes, a soldier. But whatever path he chooses, tell him to serve with dignity and never forget that his first duty is to our people." These kinds of interactions had become typical for Ibrahim. Unlike many leaders who surrounded themselves with layers of security and protocol, he insisted on remaining accessible to ordinary citizens. His security detail had learned to adapt to a president who would stop his convoy to help change a tire on a broken-down car, or who would walk through markets without advance notice, listening to vendors' concerns. As the auditorium filled, the diversity of attendees was striking. Students from across West Africa had traveled to Ouagadougou for this event. There were young people from Senegal who had heard about Burkina Faso's education reforms, Ghanaian entrepreneurs interested in the country's youth employment programs, and Malian activists studying Traoré's approach to community-based security. In the diplomatic section sat ambassadors and cultural attachés from various countries, some supportive of Burkina Faso's new direction, others skeptical. International journalists occupied several rows, their cameras and recording equipment ready to capture what they hoped would be newsworthy moments. The academic section was particularly notable. Professors from the University of Ouagadougou sat alongside visiting scholars from institutions across Africa and Europe. Among them, though few knew it yet, was Dr. Marcel Dubois, a 58-year-old French political scientist who had made his career studying what he termed the failure cycles of African governance. Dr. Dubois represented a particular type of Western academic, one who had spent decades analyzing Africa from a distance, viewing the continent through the lens of theories developed in European and American universities. His office at the Sorbonne was filled with books about African politics, but he had spent relatively little time actually living and working in African communities. He had come to Ouagadougou with a specific agenda. His latest research paper, still unpublished, was titled The Ibrahim Traoré Phenomenon: Why Military Coups Still Represent Regression in West African Democracy. He had attended today's event hoping to gather material that would support his thesis that young military leaders, like Traoré, were simply the latest iteration of Africa's authoritarian tendencies. At exactly 2:00 p.m., Ibrahim Traoré entered the auditorium. The response was immediate and overwhelming, a standing ovation that lasted nearly 5 minutes. Students chanted his name in multiple languages. Some held signs with messages like, "Our Africa, our future," and "Sovereignty is our right." But Ibrahim gestured for calm, his expression serious but warm. When he reached the podium, his first words were not in French, the country's official language, but in Moor, "My brothers and sisters, we gather today not to celebrate one person, but to discuss our shared future." He then switched to French for the benefit of international attendees. "Today, I want to talk with you, not to you, but with you, about what it means to be young and African in the 21st century. I want to discuss the challenges we face, yes, but more importantly, the opportunities we are creating for ourselves for the next 45 minutes. Ibrahim delivered what many would later describe as one of the most compelling speeches of his presidency. He spoke about Burkina Faso's mineral wealth and how previous governments had allowed foreign companies to extract gold, manganese, and other resources while leaving local communities in poverty. "We have decided," he said, his voice rising with conviction, "that our resources will benefit our people first. This doesn't mean we reject partnerships with other countries, but it means these partnerships must be based on equality and mutual respect, not on the colonial relationships of the past." He discussed education reform, explaining how Burkina Faso was transitioning from a French-centered curriculum to one that incorporated indigenous languages and African history while maintaining international standards. "Our children should learn about Mansa Musa and the great trading empires of West Africa alongside Napoleon and Caesar," he declared. "They should study in languages that connect them to their grandparents' wisdom, not just to former colonial powers." The speech touched on healthcare, economic development, and regional security. But what struck many listeners was how Ibrahim connected each policy area to personal stories. When discussing healthcare, he told the story of his own mother, who had died from a preventable illness because the nearest hospital was too far away and too expensive for their family to afford. "That's why," he said, "we are not just building hospitals in Ouagadougou. We are building health centers in every district, training community health workers, and ensuring that no mother dies because she cannot access basic medical care." When Ibrahim finished his prepared remarks, he stepped away from the podium and sat on a chair at the front of the stage, making the setting more informal and accessible. "Now," he said with a smile, "I want to hear from you. What questions do you have? What concerns? What ideas?" The first question came from a student studying agricultural engineering. "Mr. President, how can we modernize our farming methods while preserving traditional knowledge?" Ibrahim's response demonstrated the thoughtful approach that had earned him respect. "That's exactly the right question. We don't have to choose between tradition and modernity. In Banfora province, we have farmers who are using GPS technology to map their fields and mobile phones to access weather data, but they're also consulting with elders about planting seasons and crop rotation methods that have been used successfully for generations. The key is integration, not replacement." A journalism student asked about press freedom. "Some international organizations have criticized restrictions on certain media outlets. How do you respond?" "Press freedom is essential," Ibrahim replied, "but we must also distinguish between journalism that serves the public interest and propaganda that serves foreign interests. We have closed outlets that were directly funded by groups seeking to destabilize our country. But we have also established new training programs for journalists and increased funding for public media that reflects our own perspectives, not just international viewpoints." Question after question came from the engaged audience. A young entrepreneur wanted to know about access to credit for small businesses. A medical student inquired about opportunities for specialists to practice in rural areas. A computer science major asked about internet infrastructure development. For 40 minutes, Ibrahim demonstrated the kind of detailed policy knowledge and personal engagement that had made him popular among young Africans. He didn't just give general answers. He provided specific examples, cited statistics, and often connected policies to individual people he had met during his travels around the country. The atmosphere in the auditorium was electric. This was not a typical political event with carefully scripted questions and prepared responses. This was a genuine dialogue between a leader and the people he served. It was during this question and answer period that Dr. Marcel Dubois made his move. He had been sitting quietly in the back section of the auditorium, taking notes and becoming increasingly frustrated by what he saw as the audience's uncritical acceptance of Ibrahim's responses. From his perspective, this was exactly the kind of populist performance that had led to disappointment throughout African history. Charismatic young leaders making grand promises, excited crowds believing that this time would be different, and ultimately, the same cycles of poverty, corruption, and authoritarianism. Dr. Dubois had witnessed similar scenes in other African countries. He remembered the early days of Jerry Rawlings in Ghana, the initial optimism around Thomas Sankara in Burkina Faso itself, and dozens of other leaders who had begun with popular support but had ultimately failed to transform their societies. As the formal question period was winding down, Dr. Dubois stood up. His expensive European suit and perfectly groomed appearance made him stand out among the more casually dressed students and local academics around him. "I have a question," he announced in accented French, his voice carrying clearly across the auditorium. Ibrahim nodded politely. "Of course, please, but what came next was not a question. It was an attack. You call yourself a leader?" Dr. Dubois' voice dripped with condescension. "You're nothing but another military dictator hiding behind fancy words. Your so-called revolution is just chaos disguised as patriotism." The change in the auditorium's atmosphere was immediate and palpable. The warm, engaged mood that had characterized the previous hour evaporated in seconds. Students shifted uncomfortably. Some began to murmur angrily. The moderator, a professor from the university's political science department, reached for his microphone, clearly considering whether to intervene. But Dr. Dubois wasn't finished. He seemed energized by the shocked reaction he had provoked. Standing fully now, he continued his assault. "I've been studying African politics for 30 years. I've seen dozens of leaders like you come and go, young, ambitious, full of promises about sovereignty and development. But mark my words, you'll end up like all the rest, a disappointment to your people and a footnote in history." The auditorium had become completely silent, except for Dr. Dubois' voice. Even the journalists, who had been hoping for dramatic moments, seemed stunned by the level of disrespect being displayed. "Your country remains one of the poorest in the world despite all your rhetoric about resource sovereignty. Your people are still hungry while you give speeches about African dignity. What have you actually accomplished besides generating headlines and social media content?" All eyes turned to Ibrahim Traoré. This was the moment that would define not just the rest of the event, but potentially his entire presidency. How a leader responds to public humiliation, especially in front of an international audience, reveals character in ways that prepared speeches never can. Ibrahim's military training had taught him to remain calm under pressure. His experience surviving multiple assassination attempts had shown him that survival often depended on controlling his emotional responses. But this moment felt different. This wasn't about physical survival. It was about dignity, respect, and the future of African leadership. Those who knew Ibrahim well could see the slight change in his expression. Not anger, but something deeper, a recognition that this moment was about more than just defending himself. This was about defending an idea, a vision of what African leadership could become. The silence stretched on. Dr. Dubois stood smugly, clearly convinced he had delivered a devastating blow that would expose this young African leader as just another emotional, inexperienced politician who would respond with anger and prove all the stereotypes about African governance. Security personnel tensed, their hands moving toward their radios. Some students in the front rows began to stand ready to defend their president. The potential for this situation to escalate into something much more serious was obvious to everyone in the room. Ibrahim took a slow, deliberate breath. His military posture remained perfect, but his eyes showed deep thought rather than preparation for battle. He looked around the auditorium, making eye contact with students, professors, journalists, and even some of the diplomats in attendance. When he finally spoke, his voice was so quiet that the entire auditorium had to strain to hear him. This quiet response was itself unexpected. Most people anticipated either explosive anger or defensive justification. "Sir," he began, his tone carrying none of the hostility that Dr. Dubois' attack seemed to invite. "I want to thank you for your question." The audience was stunned. "Thank him for that insulting tirade?" Some students looked at each other in confusion. Even Dr. Dubois appeared taken aback by this unexpected response. Ibrahim continued, his voice growing slightly stronger but remaining remarkably calm. "You see, your words remind me of something very important. They remind me why we fight for true independence. Not just political independence, but mental independence, intellectual independence, and most importantly, the independence to define ourselves. This was not the response Dr. Dubois had anticipated. He had come prepared for an argument, armed with statistics and historical precedents designed to demolish this young African leader's credibility. He had expected either angry defensiveness that would make Ibrahim look unstable, or weak deflection that would make him appear incompetent. Instead, he was facing something entirely different. A leader who was using the attack as an opportunity for deeper reflection and education. Ibrahim stepped away from the podium and began walking closer to the audience, making the moment more intimate and personal. This physical movement was significant. Instead of hiding behind the authority of his position, he was making himself more vulnerable, more human. You speak of history, sir, and you are absolutely right to do so. History is indeed full of leaders who failed their people. But history is also full of moments when those who were underestimated rose to change the course of nations. Students began to lean forward, sensing that something extraordinary was happening. This wasn't just a political response designed to deflect criticism. This was becoming a masterclass in leadership under pressure, a demonstration of how to maintain dignity while being publicly attacked. But let me tell you something about the history you reference, Ibrahim continued, his voice taking on the tone of a teacher rather than a politician. Much of what we call African political failure has roots in systems designed to ensure failure. When colonial powers left our continent, they didn't leave behind the institutions of governance they had built in their own countries over centuries. They left behind extractive systems designed to benefit external powers. Dr. Dubois shifted uncomfortably. This was not the emotional outburst he had hoped to provoke. That doesn't excuse the failures of African leaders, Ibrahim continued. Many of us have indeed failed our people, but it does mean that when we succeed, we must do so despite systems designed to ensure our failure. And that, sir, requires a different kind of strength than the strength required to govern in countries where the systems support good governance. The audience was completely absorbed now. Even Dr. Dubois found himself listening intently, despite his initial intention to simply provoke and expose. You mentioned that my country is still poor, and you are correct. But let me ask you something. How do you measure poverty? Is it only by GDP per capita, a measure created by economists in wealthy countries? Or might it also be measured by dignity, by self-determination, by the ability of people to shape their own destiny? Ibrahim paused, looking directly at Dr. Dubois. I would rather lead a poor country that belongs to its people than a wealthy country that belongs to foreign interests. But then Ibrahim did something that nobody in the auditorium expected. Instead of continuing with abstract political philosophy, he began to tell a personal story. You asked about hungry children, sir. Let me tell you about hungry children. His voice took on a different quality, more intimate and emotional. 3 months ago, I was in a village called Seba in the far north of our country. I met a grandmother named Aminata, who was caring for 6 orphaned grandchildren. The auditorium grew even quieter, if that was possible. Even the journalists stopped taking notes and began simply listening. These children's parents had been killed in an attack by terrorists. Terrorists who, by the way, were using weapons and receiving funding from some of the same international networks that have profited from Africa's instability for decades. Dr. Dubois' confident posture began to change slightly. This personal narrative was not what he had prepared for. This grandmother, this elderly woman with a bent back and weathered hands, was trying to grow millet in soil that hadn't seen proper rain in 2 years. She was using seeds she had saved from the previous harvest, working without modern equipment but determined to feed her family. Ibrahim's voice carried an emotional weight that made every person in the auditorium feel as if they were standing in that distant village, seeing the cracked earth and the struggling plants. Her granddaughter, Fatoumata, maybe 8 years old, asked me why the bad men had taken her parents away. She wanted to know if I could bring them back. Several people in the audience were visibly moved. Some students wiped their eyes discreetly. I couldn't bring her parents back, sir, but I could promise her something else. I could promise her that we would never again allow foreign powers to determine our destiny. I could promise her that we would build a Burkina Faso where she could go to school, where she could dream of becoming a doctor or an engineer or even a president, without asking permission from anyone outside our borders. Dr. Dubois found himself in an unexpected position. He had come to this event with a clear agenda: to expose what he saw as the naive idealism of another young African leader destined for failure. Instead, he was being confronted with the human reality behind the political rhetoric. Ibrahim continued, "You see, sir, when you study African politics from a distance, you see statistics and historical patterns. But when you live African politics, you see faces. You see children like Fatoumata, who deserve better than what they've inherited." The transformation in the room was remarkable. What had begun as a hostile confrontation was becoming something deeper, a dialogue about different ways of understanding leadership, success, and responsibility. "You speak of history judging me, and you are right. History will judge me. But I wonder, will history also judge those who stood by and watched while Africa's children went hungry? While our resources were extracted to build universities and hospitals on other continents? While our brightest minds were forced to seek opportunity elsewhere because systems designed to keep us dependent told them there was no future at home?" Ibrahim walked back toward the podium, but instead of standing behind it, he sat on its edge, making himself even more accessible and human. "I am not perfect," he continued. "I make mistakes every day. I am learning as I lead, just as every leader in history has done. But the difference between us, sir, is that when I fail my own people. People I grew up with, people whose struggles I've lived, people whose dreams I share." He looked directly at Dr. Dubois again. "When the systems you defend fail, they fail people you've never met. In languages you don't speak, in circumstances you've studied but never experienced. What happened next would be replayed on news channels and social media platforms around the world for weeks to come." Instead of continuing to defend himself or launching a counterattack against Dr. Dubois, Ibrahim Traoré did something that shocked everyone in the auditorium. He stood up and began walking directly toward Dr. Dubois. Security personnel immediately tensed. The moderator reached for his microphone. Several audience members gasped audibly. In the age of viral videos and international incidents, everyone expected confrontation. They expected drama. They expected anger. Instead, when Ibrahim reached Dr. Dubois, he extended his hand. "Sir," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed auditorium, "I would like to invite you to come with me to Seba next week. I want you to meet that grandmother I spoke about. I want you to meet Fatoumata, the little girl who dreams of being president." Dr. Dubois stared at the outstretched hand, clearly thrown completely off balance. This wasn't in any playbook he knew. He had come prepared for an argument, armed with statistics and historical precedents to demolish this young African leader. He hadn't come prepared for an invitation. I don't understand," Dr. Dubois stammered, perhaps for the first time in decades finding himself at a loss for words. Ibrahim didn't withdraw his hand. "I mean it sincerely, sir. Come see the villages where we're building schools with our own resources. Taught by teachers we've trained ourselves. Using curricula we've designed to reflect our own history and dreams." The audience watched in stunned silence as something extraordinary unfolded before them. This wasn't political theater or a calculated publicity stunt. This was genuine human connection happening in real time. Come see the agricultural cooperatives where former soldiers are working alongside farmers to reclaim land that was abandoned during the conflict. Come see the technology centers where young people are developing solutions to African problems using African innovation. Ibrahim's voice softened even more. "I understand your skepticism, sir. I really do. You've seen promises broken before. You've watched leaders disappoint their people. But I'm not asking you to trust my words. I'm asking you to trust your own eyes. Come see what we're building, and then judge for yourself whether it's genuine progress or just more of the same." Dr. Dubois looked around the room, suddenly aware that hundreds of eyes were on him, that cameras were recording this moment, that his response would be analyzed and discussed across academic and political circles. His academic pride warred with something else, perhaps curiosity, perhaps a recognition that he was facing something different than he had expected, perhaps simple human decency in the face of unexpected grace. "You would do that?" he asked quietly, his voice barely audible. "Even after what I said?" Ibrahim smiled, a genuine, warm smile without any trace of condescension or superiority. Especially because of what you said, sir. Criticism from someone with your knowledge and experience isn't an insult, it's an opportunity. If I can convince someone like you that our path is right, then maybe I really am onto something. The transformation in the auditorium was palpable. Students who had been angry moments before were now leaning forward with fascination. Journalists were furiously taking notes, recognizing that they were witnessing something that would define how this story was told around the world. Dr. Dubois slowly reached out and shook Ibrahim's hand. "Yes," he said, his voice growing stronger. "Yes, I'll come." The applause that erupted wasn't polite or obligatory. It was thunderous, emotional, sustained. People throughout the auditorium stood up, not just clapping but cheering, some wiping tears from their eyes. But Ibrahim raised his hand. "Asking for quiet one more time. Thank you," he said, still addressing Dr. Dubois but speaking loudly enough for everyone to hear. "And sir, I want you to know, if after your visit you still believe I'm wrong, I want you to tell me. I want you to tell the world. Because ultimately, this isn't about proving anyone right or wrong. This is about finding the best path forward for our people." Ibrahim turned to address the entire audience for what would be his final words of the day. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is what leadership really means. Not being afraid of criticism, not surrounding yourself with people who only agree with you, but having the courage to test your ideas against reality and the wisdom of others, even those who disagree with you." Dr. Dubois nodded slowly, and something in his expression suggested that his entire perception of this young president had shifted in the space of just a few minutes. "This is how we build a better Africa," Ibrahim continued. "Not by silencing our critics, but by engaging with them honestly. Not by refusing to be challenged, but by welcoming challenges as opportunities to grow stronger." The audience rose in another round of applause, but this time it felt different. Not just appreciative, but inspired. Students were looking at each other with new understanding. Journalists were already planning stories that would focus not on conflict, but on the possibility of dialogue and growth. "And to all of you," Ibrahim said, gesturing to the students in particular, "remember this moment. Remember that the way we respond to our critics defines not just who we are, but who we inspire others to become." As Ibrahim walked back toward the podium one final time, Dr. Dubois remained standing, still processing what had just happened. A confrontation that he had initiated to embarrass a young African leader had become a moment of genuine human connection and mutual respect. 2 weeks later, Dr. Marcel Dubois found himself in circumstances he never could have imagined. He was sitting in the passenger seat of a dusty Land Rover, bouncing along a rough road in northern Burkina Faso, heading toward the village of Seba. The academic who had arrived in Ouagadougou with prepared criticisms and firmly held assumptions about African governance was now genuinely nervous about what he might find. His entire career had been built on analyzing African political failures from the comfortable distance of European universities. Now he was about to see up close whether his theories matched reality. Ibrahim had insisted on driving personally rather than sending a delegation. "If you're going to understand what we're doing," he had said, "you need to see it through our eyes, not through the eyes of intermediaries." During the 3-hour journey, Ibrahim shared stories about the villages they passed, the challenges each community faced, and the solutions they were developing together. He spoke about the difficulty of providing security in remote areas, the challenges of building infrastructure with limited resources, and the delicate balance between respecting traditional authority and implementing necessary changes. "You see that school?" Ibrahim pointed to a simple concrete building with solar panels on its roof. "Last year, that village had no school at all. Children had to walk 15 kilometers to the nearest education facility. Now they're learning in their own language as well as French, and in the evenings, the building becomes a community center where adults learn literacy and basic mathematics." Dr. Dubois took notes, but more importantly, he began to see the landscape differently. What had appeared to him as simple rural poverty began to reveal itself as communities in transition, places where people were actively working to improve their circumstances despite enormous challenges. When they finally arrived in Seba, Dr. Dubois was struck by the warmth of the reception. The entire village had gathered to welcome their president, but there was nothing formal or orchestrated about it. Children ran alongside the vehicle. Elderly people emerged from their compounds. Young adults paused in their work to wave and call greetings. This was not a political rally or a carefully staged event. This was a community welcoming someone they genuinely respected and trusted. The moment that would change Dr. Dubois' perspective forever came when he met 8-year-old Fatoumata, the girl Ibrahim had spoken about during their confrontation at the university. She was smaller than Dr. Dubois had expected, with bright eyes and a shy smile. When Ibrahim introduced her, explaining in the local language that this was a visitor from far away who wanted to learn about their village, she responded with the kind of dignity and poise that impressed the academic immediately. Ask her what she wants to be when she grows up. Dr. Dubois requested through Ibrahim's translation. Fatoumata's response, translated by Ibrahim, made both men smile. She says she wants to be a president like you, so she can make sure no other children lose their parents to bad men. But it was Fatoumata's follow-up question that truly moved Dr. Dubois. She wants to know if you have children, and if they go to school in your country. When Dr. Dubois explained through Ibrahim that he had 2 grown daughters who had both attended university, Fatoumata nodded seriously and said something that made Ibrahim chuckle. What did she say? Dr. Dubois asked. She said that's good because education should be for everyone, not just people in some countries. She says when she becomes president, she wants children everywhere to have the same opportunities. Dr. Dubois knelt down to Fatoumata's level. Through Ibrahim's translation, he spoke to her directly for the first time. I want to apologize, little one. I said some unkind things about your president without knowing the whole story. I was wrong. When Ibrahim translated this, Fatoumata's response made both men laugh despite the seriousness of the moment. Adults say silly things sometimes. My grandmother says that's why children need to forgive them and help them learn better. Over the next 2 days, Dr. Dubois experienced a complete education in the realities of grassroots development in rural Africa. He visited the school where former child soldiers were being trained as teachers. He met farmers who were experimenting with drought-resistant crops developed by researchers at the University of Ouagadougou. He observed a community court session where traditional elders worked alongside government-trained mediators to resolve local disputes. What struck him most was the integration of old and new, traditional and modern. This wasn't the wholesale rejection of African culture that he had observed in some development programs, nor was it a romantic return to an imagined past. It was a thoughtful synthesis that respected traditional wisdom while embracing beneficial innovations. At the health clinic, he met a young woman named Mariam, who had been trained as a community health worker. She showed him how she used a smartphone app to diagnose common illnesses and determine when patients needed to be referred to the regional hospital. But she also demonstrated her knowledge of traditional medicines that were effective for certain conditions. We don't reject modern medicine, she explained through Ibrahim's translation, but we also don't reject knowledge that has helped our people for generations. We use what works. Dr. Dubois watched children learn mathematics using methods that incorporated traditional counting systems alongside international curricula. He observed young people using solar-powered computers to develop software applications designed to address local challenges like crop disease identification and water resource management. This is what sovereignty looks like in practice, Ibrahim explained as they watched teenagers teach elderly villagers how to use mobile banking systems. It's not isolation from the world. It's engagement with the world on our own terms. On his final evening in Seba, Dr. Dubois sat with Ibrahim and grandmother Aminata around a fire, sharing a simple meal of millet porridge and vegetables grown in the school's garden. The conversation, translated by Ibrahim, touched on everything from climate change to international relations to the meaning of progress. I owe you an apology, Dr. Dubois said as the sun set over the Sahel. And more than that, I owe you my respect. I came here expecting to find evidence of failure, but instead, I found something I haven't seen in decades of studying African politics. Genuine hope backed by real action. Ibrahim shook his head. You don't owe me anything, sir. But perhaps you could help us in a different way now. You have platforms we don't have, audiences we can't reach. If you truly believe in what you've seen here, help us tell this story. Help the world understand that Africa's solutions will come from Africa. But that doesn't mean we're rejecting the world. It means we're engaging with it as equals. Grandmother Aminata, through Ibrahim's translation, offered her own perspective. She says that wisdom comes from listening as much as from speaking. She says you listened with your heart as well as your mind, and that's why you were able to see what many visitors miss. 3 months later, Dr. Marcel Dubois published an article in The Guardian titled, "I tried to humiliate a young African leader. Instead, he changed my life." The piece was unlike anything he had written before. Personal, reflective, and honest about his own biases and assumptions. The article began, "I went to Burkina Faso to prove a point about African governance. Instead, I learned a lesson about the dangers of academic arrogance and the power of genuine leadership." He described the confrontation at the university, his own motivations for attacking Ibrahim publicly, and the unexpected invitation that followed. But the bulk of the article focused on his experiences in Seba and the lessons he had learned about development, dignity, and the complexity of leadership in challenging circumstances. "I realized," he wrote, "that I had been studying Africa for 30 years without truly understanding it. I had analyzed political systems without considering the human beings who lived within them. I had judged leaders based on international standards without understanding the unique challenges they faced." The article went viral, garnering over 2 million shares across social media platforms and sparking conversations about African leadership, academic responsibility, and the power of responding to criticism with invitation rather than insult. But perhaps more importantly, it began to change the way some international academics and journalists approached Africa. Universities began requiring students studying African politics to spend time in African communities. News organizations started sending reporters for longer assignments that allowed for deeper understanding of local contexts. Dr. Dubois himself became an advocate for what he termed engaged scholarship, research that involved genuine partnership with the communities being studied rather than distant analysis. The real legacy of that confrontation wasn't found in international headlines or academic discussions, however. It was found in the hundreds of students who had witnessed that moment in the university auditorium and learned something profound about leadership under pressure. Aminata Sawadogo, a political science student who had been in the front row that day, later said, "I had never seen anything like it. Someone tried to humiliate our president in front of the world, and instead of fighting back with anger, he fought back with invitation, with openness, with genuine strength. That's when I knew I wanted to go into public service." Aminata went on to establish a youth leadership program that brought together young people from across West Africa to learn about conflict resolution, community development, and principled leadership. The program's motto, inspired by Ibrahim's response to Dr. Dubois, was "Transform critics into partners." The video of Ibrahim's response was watched by millions of young Africans across the continent. In Senegal, university students began organizing dignity dialogues, where critics and supporters of various policies could engage respectfully. In Ghana, a group of young entrepreneurs started a mentorship program based on Ibrahim's principle of turning criticism into opportunity. In Nigeria, a young politician facing hostile questions during a town hall meeting remembered Ibrahim's example and invited his harshest critic to visit his constituency and see his development projects firsthand. The resulting collaboration led to significant improvements in local infrastructure and became a model for other politicians. Dr. Dubois, meanwhile, had undergone his own transformation. He established a scholarship program that brought African students to European universities while also sending European students to study in Africa, creating the kind of genuine exchange that builds understanding rather than dependency. He began co-teaching courses with African professors, using video conferencing to connect classrooms in Paris with classrooms in Dakar, Accra, and Ouagadougou. His research focus shifted from analyzing African political failures to documenting innovative solutions emerging from African communities. "I realized," he said in a later interview, "that I had been part of the problem. My research was reinforcing stereotypes rather than challenging them. I was contributing to the very patterns of condescension and dismissal that I now recognized as harmful." His new research focused on what he called indigenous innovation, the ways African communities were developing solutions to complex challenges using combinations of traditional knowledge and modern technology. His papers began appearing in journals with titles like Community-Based Security Models in the Sahel, Lessons from Burkina Faso, and Educational Innovation in Post-Colonial Africa. The integration of indigenous and international curricula. But perhaps his most important contribution was a book he co-authored with Ibrahim Traoré himself, titled Leadership in Crisis, Dignity, Development, and the Future of Africa. The book combined academic analysis with personal narratives, policy discussions with community stories, creating a new model for how scholars and practitioners could collaborate. 6 months after the confrontation, Ibrahim received a package that would become one of his most treasured possessions. It was from Fatoumata, the 8-year-old girl from Seba. Her teacher had helped her write a letter in French, but she had also included a hand-drawn picture showing 2 men shaking hands under a tree with children playing around them. The letter read, "Dear Mr. President, my teacher helped me write this letter. I wanted to thank you for showing us that even when people are mean to you, you can still be kind to them. That's what real presidents do." The old man from far away came back to see us again. He brought books for our school and medicine for our clinic. He told my grandmother that meeting us changed his heart. She said that's what happens when people listen with love instead of anger. "I am still studying hard because I still want to be president like you someday. But now I also want to be like you in how you treat people who don't understand you at first. My grandmother says that the strongest people are not the ones who fight the hardest, but the ones who can make enemies become friends. She says you are very strong. Thank you for keeping your promise to come back and see us. Thank you for bringing the old man so he could learn the truth. Thank you for showing me what a good president looks like. Your friend, Fatoumata P.S." The old man asked me to tell you that he is sorry he was rude to you. He said he learned that being smart in books is different from being wise in life. Ibrahim kept that drawing on his desk next to more formal gifts from heads of state and international organizations. When visitors asked about it, he would tell the story of his confrontation with Dr. Dubois and the lessons it had taught him about leadership. "Children see things more clearly than adults sometimes," he would say. Fatoumata understood something that took Dr. Dubois and me longer to learn, that our greatest strength lies not in defeating our opponents, but in helping them see what we see. The story of Ibrahim's response began to influence political discourse far beyond Africa. Videos of his calm response to Dr. Dubois' attack were shown in leadership seminars from Harvard Business School to the London School of Economics. Political scientists began studying what they termed the Traoré response, the strategy of responding to hostile criticism with invitation rather than counterattack. Several case studies emerged of leaders in other contexts using similar approaches with remarkable success. A mayor in Brazil facing harsh criticism from community activists invited them to spend a week shadowing him to understand the constraints and challenges of municipal governance. The result was a collaborative approach to budget planning that became a model for other cities. A corporate CEO in South Korea facing angry shareholders invited the most vocal critics to join a special advisory committee that would have direct access to company operations and decision-making processes. The transparency and collaboration that resulted led to improved performance and restored confidence. In Northern Ireland, community leaders dealing with persistent sectarian tensions began using Ibrahim's approach, inviting critics from opposing communities to visit and engage directly with the people affected by various policies and programs. Dr. Dubois' transformation had sparked what some called a methodology revolution in African studies. Universities across Europe and North America began requiring students to spend significant time in African communities as part of their degree programs. The traditional model of African studies, where Predominantly non-African scholars analyzed Africa from a distance, began to give way to collaborative approaches that centered African voices and perspectives. Research projects increasingly involved partnerships between international and African institutions, with African scholars taking leading roles in defining research questions and interpreting results. Dr. Dubois established what became known as the Seba Protocol, a research methodology that required scholars to live and work within communities they were studying for extended periods, to learn local languages, and to ensure that research results were shared with and beneficial to the communities involved. If you're going to study people, he would tell his students, you need to be willing to be studied by them as well. You need to be open to having your assumptions challenged and your perspectives changed. The protocol became widely adopted, leading to research that was more nuanced, more accurate, and more useful to the communities it studied. African universities began attracting more international scholars who were willing to engage in this more respectful and collaborative approach. The most profound impact of Ibrahim's response, however, was on young people across Africa who had witnessed the confrontation or heard about it through social media and news coverage. In universities across the continent, student leaders began adopting what they called Traoré tactics, responding to criticism and conflict with invitation and engagement rather than defensiveness or counterattack. At the University of Cape Town in South Africa, student government leaders facing protests over fee increases invited the most vocal critics to join budget committees and participate directly in negotiations with university administration. The collaborative approach led to more creative solutions and reduced the antagonism that had characterized previous negotiations. In Kenya, young political candidates began using Ibrahim's approach when facing hostile questions during campaign events. Instead of dismissing critics or responding with prepared talking points, they invited critics to visit their constituencies and engage directly with the communities they served. A young woman named Grace Wanjiku, running for county assembly in Kiambu, faced harsh criticism during a public forum from an older male politician who questioned whether someone her age could understand the challenges facing rural communities. "Sir," she responded, echoing Ibrahim's approach, "I would like to invite you to spend a day with me visiting the villages in this constituency. I want you to meet the young mothers who are starting businesses with microloans, the students who are using solar-powered computers to access online education, and the farmers who are using climate-smart agriculture techniques to improve their yields." The older politician, caught off guard by the invitation, agreed. The resulting collaboration led to a joint campaign that combined his experience with her innovative approaches, ultimately benefiting the entire constituency regardless of who won the election. What had begun as a single moment of grace under pressure was becoming a cultural movement. Across Africa, the idea of responding to criticism with invitation was taking root in communities, organizations, and institutions. Traditional councils began inviting young people who criticized ancient practices to participate in discussions about how traditions could evolve while maintaining their essential values. Religious leaders facing questions about their teachings began organizing interfaith dialogues that brought together critics and supporters for honest conversations. Even in business settings, the Traoré approach was being adopted. Company executives facing employee complaints began inviting the most vocal critics to join management teams or advisory committees, leading to improvements in workplace conditions and company performance. The shift was particularly notable in how conflicts were resolved. Instead of the winner-take-all approaches that had characterized many disputes, communities began experimenting with processes that sought to transform opponents into collaborators. Land dispute in rural Ghana that had been ongoing for years was resolved when community leaders invited critics from both sides to form a joint committee that would develop a solution together. The resulting agreement not only ended the conflict, but created a new model for managing shared resources. Ibrahim's approach began attracting attention from international peace-building organizations and conflict resolution experts. The Carter Center invited him to share his experiences at a conference on democratic leadership in challenging circumstances, the United Nations Development Program commissioned a study on transformative leadership in Africa, using Ibrahim's response to Dr. Dubois as a central case study. The report highlighted how traditional approaches to criticism and conflict often perpetuated divisions, while transformative approaches could create opportunities for growth and collaboration. Ibrahim was invited to speak at Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government, where he addressed future diplomats and policymakers about the importance of dignity in international relations. "When we respond to disrespect with respect," he told the audience, "we don't just change the immediate situation. We change the entire dynamic of the relationship. We create space for understanding that didn't exist before." His speech at Harvard was attended by ambassadors, international development officials, and academic leaders. Many left with new perspectives on how to engage with African leaders and communities more respectfully and effectively. For Ibrahim personally, the incident with Dr. Dubois became a defining moment that shaped his entire approach to leadership. He often reflected on how different things might have been if he had responded with anger or defensiveness. "I almost failed that test," he admitted in a later interview. "My first instinct was to defend myself, to point out Dr. Dubois' ignorance and arrogance. But something made me pause. And in that pause, I remembered why I became a leader in the first place." The pause he referred to became a central part of his leadership philosophy. He began teaching other leaders about the importance of that moment between provocation and response, the space where choices are made that determine not just immediate outcomes, but long-term relationships and possibilities. His approach wasn't without costs. Some critics accused him of being too conciliatory, of failing to stand up strongly enough to those who disrespected Africa and its leaders. There were times when his invitations were rejected, when his grace was met with continued hostility. But the successes far outweighed the failures. The transformation of Dr. Dubois from critic to advocate became a template that worked in many other contexts. International relationships that might have been damaged by confrontation were instead strengthened by collaboration. Years later, the story of Ibrahim Traoré's response to Dr. Marcel Dubois continued to inspire leaders around the world. Leadership training programs used it as an example of emotional intelligence under pressure. Diplomatic schools taught it as a case study in transforming potential crises into opportunities for deeper understanding. But perhaps most importantly, it became part of the story that young Africans told themselves about what was possible. In a continent that had too often been defined by its failures and limitations, Ibrahim's response demonstrated the power of dignity, wisdom, and grace. The little girl from Seba, Fatoumata, was now in secondary school, still studying hard with her dream of becoming president. Her teachers reported that she had become a natural mediator among her classmates, someone who could resolve conflicts and bring opposing sides together. "She learned something important that day when the president visited," her teacher observed. "She learned that strength doesn't come from winning arguments, but from helping people understand each other." Dr. Dubois, now in his 60s, had become one of Africa's most respected advocates in European academic circles. His transformation from critic to champion had given him unique credibility. When speaking to skeptical audiences about African innovation and leadership, Dr. Ibrahim himself continued to lead Burkina Faso with the same principles he had demonstrated that day in the university auditorium. Not every challenge could be resolved with invitation and grace, but the approach had become so fundamental to his leadership style that it influenced every major decision he made. The story of that March afternoon in Ouagadougou became more than just a political anecdote. It became a parable about the power of responding to hostility with humanity, of meeting criticism with curiosity, and of transforming enemies into allies through the simple act of seeing them as fellow human beings rather than opponents to be defeated. In a world increasingly characterized by polarization and conflict, Ibrahim Traoré's response offered a different model, one based on the radical idea that our critics might have something valuable to teach us, and that our greatest strength lies not in proving others wrong, but in creating space for everyone to be right about something. The young president who had stood calm and dignified in the face of public humiliation had shown that true leadership isn't about having all the answers, but about having the courage to ask better questions, not about silencing opposition, but about transforming it into collaboration. and in the dusty village of Seba, where an 8-year-old girl continued to dream of becoming president. The lesson lived on, that the strongest people are not those who fight the hardest, but those who can make enemies become friends. As Ibrahim often said in the speeches that followed, the moment someone tries to diminish you is the moment you have the greatest opportunity to show who you really are. We can choose to respond with anger and prove them right about our limitations, or we can respond with dignity and prove them wrong about our possibilities. That choice, made in a split second on a March afternoon in Ouagadougou, continued to inspire leaders and communities around the world, proving that sometimes the most powerful response to an attack is an invitation, and the strongest answer to criticism is an open hand extended in friendship. The legacy of that moment lives on, not just in the policies and programs it inspired, but in the countless individuals who learned that transformation is possible, of themselves, of their critics, and of the world around them, if they have the courage to respond to hostility with hope and to hatred with the radical possibility of love.